Welcome to the Friday, November 12th History Bites lecture program. My name is George Naughton, and I'm the president of the Amherst Historical Society. Today's guest is Emily Dickinson scholar Aife Murray, who will talk about her podcast, The Slave is Gone. Ms. Murray has spent years working with the Emily Dickinson material, and her current work is an expansion on her book, The Maid as Muse. Her current project is an effort to promote and educate the general public, especially young people, on newly contextualized historical stories, using young Emily Dickinson as the central figure. The project's intention is to illuminate the varied experience of 19th century Amherst's tweens and teens and 20-year-olds of all backgrounds. That sounds absolutely fascinating. So without further ado, take it away.
Wow. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Am I in the screen?
I see you, yes.
Oh, okay, fabulous. Because I look like I'm up in the corner with everyone. So if you are seeing me in the screen, fabulous. Lots of faces I know and faces I don't yet know. So I'm really excited to be here. I have some big thank yous to make, but I'm going to weave those into my remarks because I first want to tell you that Maid as Muse, the dust jacket is sprawled behind me. It will be going through some pictures there, and it's having a moment. And I couldn't be more pleased. And I'm going to do a quick screen share to show you who knew that a dozen years after I would, okay, so yeah, okay. So there's a novel, Emily's House, that comes from the position of the servants, or in particular, Margaret Maher, a long-term servant. So that's one development. And if you like to get your history through novels, I recommend it. It's fabulous. Dishy read. And here's a dishy TV series from Apple TV that just dropped its third season. It's fantastic. And that's the vehicle for which, for instance, the plot twist in my first chapter is the plot twist in season 1, episode 1. So pretty exciting. And now I will stop sharing so that I won't be a little head in the corner. So, and then I want to say that the person who created the Dickinson series for Apple, Elena Smith, said in the Twitterverse, hard to imagine a more meaningful response to the show than a podcast with two Black poets and the scholar who first illuminated the importance of Emily's Irish maid to her writing voice. Let's keep talking. So the podcast people are excited about our response to their show. And so now I just want to, I have a lot of thanks to a lot of people in this room, but I want to focus particularly on the Amherst Historical Society, the Strong Museum. And I'm going to weave that in, but the first, I want to just tell you what the game plan is. I'm going to talk about the origin story for Maid as Muse, and then the origin story for the podcast. And then I think I won't circle back to Maid as Muse because of the fact that your questions will probably elicit what I was going to say anyway about the 7 reasons why it was a mistake to ignore servants in the Dickinson story. But I think that'll come out. And if you want me to, I will. But let me just say, I was 25 years ago, I was minding my business as a poet and an artist. And I was reading Dickinson. I was kind of taken by the size of her opus. Oh, and let me just say that I had been a history undergrad at Hampshire College, so history was not a new thing to me, but I was really trying to go back to my roots as a writer. So there I was in a graduate program at San Francisco State, minding my business, reading the Dickinson poems and just being astonished by the size of the opus. And I said, wow, what made it possible for her to write so much? Who made it possible? And so let me see if I move the right way. If you can see this. On my little screen, it looks like you can't see. Let's see if we can twist those servants. No, my name is in the way. So anyway, over my left shoulder, if you can see it, is a portrait of 3 people. So I pulled Richard Sewell's biography down from the shelf. And in answer to my question, who made it possible, is this portrait of 3 Dickinson servants labeled Dickinson Domestics 1870. And the man in the center reminded me very much of my grandfather. And I thought, oh, wait a minute. My great grandmother could have been scrubbing Emily Dickinson's stairs. So it started with this sort of ethnic, gallop. And then it got more interesting. And here's the first thank you to the Amherst Historical Society, because I came to Amherst to do research. And I got there too late to see the African-American Amherst exhibit. And I was too late to come to the community day where people brought photographs of their ancestors. But I met with Melinda Lelacour, who many of you may know. And she said, oh, well, there was a Dickinson descendant who came. So then I got in contact with a Dickinson descendant, saw these incredible photographs, which appear in Maida's Muse. And so thank you for having that exhibit, because even though I got to Amherst too late, I got to get, Melinda got me up to speed, and then I interviewed the descendant, saw these photographs, and that left this sort of yearning, because the photographs are so fabulous, still in private hands, but were such a fabulous doorway into African-American, Connecticut River Valley, Northwest Connecticut, Western Mass. And I really finished Maida's Muse with this sort of yearning that I could move out from Dickinson as the hub to sort of this deeper, wider story. And I got my wish 10 years later, because a podcast, because this Dickinson show came out on Apple. And so here's the origin story for the podcast. I got a phone call from a producer, storyteller, broadcast journalist, incredibly creative person, Lisa Rothman. And she called me up and she says, oh, when we're 5 months we're 5 months after the Dickinson series came out in November 2019. So we're right at the beginning of the podcast. So this is my podcast. This is my pandemic project. So we're right at the beginning of our lockdown. And she says, do you want to do a podcast? And it was like, oh, wow. Okay. And then she tells me that she and her family had watched, she has a tween son at that time, a tween son, a teen son. They live in Oakland, California. So these are not kids who are tripping over Emily Dickinson in their daily lives. And they loved the Dickinson series. And in fact, her younger son was about to do a poetry unit and asked the teacher if he could study Dickinson because they could pick who they wanted. As soon as Lisa told me that, it was like, okay, I'm in. If this piece of kind of bold, kind of outrageous popular entertainment was grabbing young kids or people and steering them to Dickinson or steering them to history, it was like, okay, this is the vehicle. This was my dream come true, basically, because I really wanted to adapt Maida's Muse to a K-12 or whatever. I wanted people to know about it. So now there's Amy Belding Brown's fabulous novel, and now there's the Apple show, and here we've been working on this. And so here comes thank you number 2, because George Naughton, as the president of the Historical Society, wrote a letter on behalf of a grant to the Massachusetts Humanities for extending Massachusetts stories. And we got that grant. So thank you. And so that's thank you number 2. And I probably owe many, many more, but those are the 2 that just jump out. And so now we get to do what I dreamed of doing when I saw those photographs of African-American life. So now is the way to extend Maida's Muse to become this bigger story of more unseen. And many of you in this who are listening may know some of those stories. And so let's keep talking. And then so now I want to just play you a clip. Where are we on time? Okay. I'm going to do a screen share again because I want you to hear 1 minute of the podcast. But whoops. Okay, whoops. But not, I'm having trouble getting, let's see if I can get there. Okay, so this is the campaign site, and just, I'm going to scroll down to but you can see we're on the podcast episode 1, which is what we've recorded so far, is already on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify. We'll go to the new website in a minute, but since the 1 minute spot is right here, I'm going to play you that.
The slave is gone.
The show that talks back to Apple TV's Dickinson. With the Aesop Rocky song that appears well before any Black person has spoken. I'm not going to say it's strange or disappointing. It's kind of expected, but it's weird. It's not okay.
As omnivorous.
Come on, omnivorous? Just like me, very hungry.
I feel like that's what's wrong with American education. I should have known she was queer. Because the brother is going to provide for her, and Emily is going to provide for her.
She's getting provided for.
And shouldn't we all be?
She's going to be spitting out babies. When is she going to get to write? You got a very ambitious poet here.
Yeah, she's like, I'm enslaved, more or less.
You're not a slave. You're just spoiled. I love how the episode amounts to a poem. Slave is gone.
Please tell me they fuck. Please, 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 please. And low.
Okay, so let's see if I can skillfully get to the next thing. So I just want to go to the website to show you. So there it is, beautiful website with our first episode, which is, oh, she's getting provided for. The bonus content, one of which includes a story about Angeline Palmer, famous story in Amherst, but now hopefully to the world, that we recorded, and we'll probably also do visuals for it. And you met the people on air, and the very, very wonderful and talented, Lisa Rothman, Matt Martin, they're brilliant. The so highly esteemed poet Marilyn Nelson, who immediately came on as our first advisor, and then said, oh, you have to bring in Terry Blackhawk, who had 2 NEH Dickinson grants, one of which was an NEH Big Read for Detroit in 2010. So Detroit and its environs, everybody was reading Dickinson for a year. So they've been amazing. And let's see. So I think I will stop the share. And so here we are, we're about to record episode 2 because we are going to apply for an NEH grant so that we have the funding to do more episodes. And let's see, I think I may stop right there. Let's see where we are, 9:30. Yeah, I mean, I could go into some things, but I don't want to I don't want to miss questions. But maybe if I could get some kind of show of hands, I could do a really quick, like, how come you found this stuff about the servants when Dickinson's life is so well studied? Could be one direction I go in, or another direction is, what were those seven reasons? So maybe if I saw a show of hands, or if there are questions already, I probably should be looking at them. Any thought? How might, guess maybe I could go into this stuff very quickly. Unless anybody's got a burning question, and I am definitely going to defer to you. Oh, did I? Okay. I realize I forgot something. Because I'm looking at the screen behind me, behind my head, and I wanted to say that the descendant that I interviewed, who had come to the community day that the museum had, was the son-in-law of Charles Thompson, who's in the image in the upper left corner. If you're seeing the way I'm seeing it. And so that was another reason why I really wanted to like open the story up, which is what how exciting it is to have this grant and to be able to hire a research assistant, which we're still looking for. So send them our way. But that will close December 1 with somebody starting in January. But at any rate, the son-in-law was Henry Hawkins, was of native descent from tribes in Pennsylvania, and I'm not sure where, Lenni Lenape, but from those nations in the Pennsylvania region, comes to Amherst. The family understanding is he was escaping tribal warfare, comes to Amherst. His wife, who's enslaved but gets freed, comes to Amherst, meets him there, comes up by the railroad, meaning Underground Railroad, and then they're living in Amherst with their kids. So, and then his second wife, when his first wife is deceased, his second wife is the daughter of Charles Thompson, Eliza Thompson, who are very associated with Amherst College, with the Dickinsons. And because of the way servants get employed in family groupings. So anyway, he and his wife, Eliza, who also worked at the Dickinson homestead for the annual fetes they had in August, or, you know what I'm saying, she's a temporary worker. So it's just exciting to start opening up these stories and identifying Eliza's picture at the Amherst College Library, which had been unidentified. So it's the only image that I now know of an African-American woman who worked for the Dickinsons. It's the only image I have. I don't have it of other people. When you saw that 1-minute clip, the photos were of the Newports, long time Amherst family, the Newports, and then Henry Hawkins' son. So, okay, so I promised to do a very quick, because I want time for questions, of why was it a mistake? And one of the things that got picked up in the Apple series was the idea that Dickinson sort of engineered to get servants in there because she was feeling that pressure of writing. And so I just want to create this sort of intimate sense from something Richard Sewell wrote to me when he was very excited that I was doing this work. And actually Polly Longsworth encouraged me to reach out to him. And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're doing this. I can hear them chatting," meaning Margaret Maher and Emily Dickinson, but she also did it with other maids too. "I can hear them as they dried the plates, the maid washing, Dickinson drying," he says. "What brings two minds closer than dishwashing at the same sink?" So that was a very wonderful form of early encouragement. So Dickinson engineers, as you'll see in the Dickinson series, if you haven't seen it, engineers to get a maid in there. And there's an immediate impact because the number of poems that she starts being able to write increase exponentially. But then when a long-term maid marries her way out of service, because in the 19th century, Social Security was family. And Margaret O'Brien, a long-term maid during this incredible prolific period writing period of Dickinson's leaves, and the writing drops to maybe less than a poem a month, and in mid 1860s or early 1860s, middle of the Civil War, she's writing a poem a day. So that's one, and Dickinson's very motivated to seek a replacement. And there's a wonderful correspondence that shows the Dickinson's engineering to woo Margaret Maher away from the Boltwood family, peers, was not easy. Boltwoods were forced to be reckoned with, but so were the Dickinsons, and the Dickinsons triumphed. So, but Margaret Maher in the Boltwood correspondence shows that. So you'd think after she'd gotten the maid, Dickinson would run upstairs and slam the door, but it doesn't appear to be what happens. It seems like she starts gravitating because she likes being around Margaret Maher, and she starts writing on scraps, the scrap writing on the bills and stuff, the stuff that collects on your counter starts. So that's an interesting occurrence. And, there may be other reasons for that. Let's see, whoops, I better look at my notes so I don't get lost. What's point number 4? Because I have, and I'm too nervous to not. Becomes an archivist. Margaret Maher becomes an archivist. Dickinson starts storing her poems in her maid's trunk because there's a storage problem. They don't have server farms. They have actual real documents, pieces of paper, as you saw the poems piling up in that little clip. So I think this must be when Margaret Maher, who probably had a chest of drawers at the Dickinson homestead, offers her trunk, and Dickinson uses it. And then this is one eyewitness account. And you probably like to have two, but to me it seemed logical. When Dickinson dies, she says, pre-death, says, Minnie, you're going to burn the letters, which Minnie did, which she bitterly regretted later, and says to Margaret Maher, and you're going to burn the poems. And somebody who has been involved in that literary production, I think, would have second thoughts about doing that. She also Margaret Maher came from a literary family anyway in Ireland. So you sort of have that respect for it. And so she doesn't. And then 6 point, Maggie's Daguerreotype. When the poems posthumously get published in Boston, Roberts Brothers, I think, is the publisher. They need a daguerreotype, they need an image. And the daguerreotype of Dickinson that we know her by as a 16-year-old was discarded by the family. And I can imagine Margaret Maher saying, oh, but I'll take it. Nobody liked it really. And so when they needed it, guess who offered or was forced to give it up, whatever. But anyway, so that ends up in, so now we know, so she saved her face, right? Save the poems, save, so it's like, and then the 7th, affecting language. Dickinson was an auditory sponge. And the letters and poems are full of vernacular. She's very excited by code switching when her father sort of uses vernacular, and you could think of the hymn stance as a type of vernacular. You could think of making poems that resemble recipes as a celebration of the vernacular for someone who's a cook and a baker. So there's all of that. Dickinson is completely in love with Robert Burns and would go around quoting him. And I did the same thing with Laura Nyro lyrics when I was a teenager. So I really understand, like, just being like in love with somebody's language or what they're having to say, and just working it into your conversation or your notes to your friends. So Dickinson did this with Burns. She was in love with Shakespeare. And so then you have people in the homestead who kind of make those varieties of English operational, right? So you're hearing voices, whether they're African American, Native American, whether they're white Amherst townspeople, Horace Church, Gardner. So, but that it becomes sort of a palpable. I don't know. I just think it was. I think she'd hit pay dirt, is all I can say, with all of this language for someone who loved words and loved. I don't know. I'm a writer, so that's where we live. That's where we live. So I don't know what time it is. Good. Okay. So, there's questions. Yay. Or there's something in the chat. Okay. So how did I find it? Find the story, I imagine. And then there's, can you talk a bit about how you select topics for the podcast to talk about? And what topics do you toss out and why? Okay. So how did I find, I imagine that question of how did you find the story? So let me try to do both of those questions. So for Maida's Muse, the evidence of servants was actually, I felt like it was hidden in plain sight because Dickinson actually writes about servants. I mean, first I went, I mean, there's just wonderful things that people talk about. Early Dickinson biographers, Genevieve Taggart. Oh gosh, who was the other one? She was very important to me. And Pollitt Pole, Josephine Pollitt Pole, right? Early Dickinson biographers from the early 20th century were important. And then, of course, Polly Longsmore's Austin and Mabel had a lot of good stuff in it. And but in Sewell and Habiger, et cetera, but also just looking at the letters was incredible. Once I started to look and say, oh, okay, so who is, Josiah Holden? And then I looked at the census. So Jim Smith's book, speaking of, who was probably part of the Amherst History Museum, I don't know, but his book about African-American Amherst, the incredible source. And then I also worked with a genealogist for other people, but who were not African-American, but that was a terrific source. So a lot of it, and looking at Boltwood correspondence, which is the Boltwood correspondence that's in Detroit, because the Boltwoods left Amherst, moved to Grand Rapids. And so there's the son, Lucius, was a librarian and an archivist and just preserved everything, including children's drawings and their first use of scissors. I mean, it's just like a charming archive. So I want to say that here I was, this artist, poet, and I had to pivot and add becoming a scholar because I had to know this story. And so it took me to many places, including Detroit, to look at those letters. So what were other things? Oh, and then eventually using the genealogy, using Jim Smith's book, but then working with a genealogist to try to come down and find descendants, and interviewing Maher Kelly descendants, interviewing Thompson Hawkins, also Horace Church, descendants of Horace Church, the long-term gardener. So anyway, it's been a blast. What can I say? I was like, Dickinson changes people's lives. So she changed my life. And here I am, all surprised that Maida's Muse is having its moment. And okay, so now Martha's question, how do we pick topics? That's a really good question because we're going to record episode 2 next week. So about a month ago, I'm looking at episode 2, we're going to respond. We're going to do our second episode, which is going to be based on season 1, episode 2, which involves the Hitchcocks, volcanoes, women's rights. And so I just went and looked at what I thought were some of the hot topics. And so I'm reading madly. I really wish I could have that research. It's just, I wish that person was here right now, but we have to move ahead because the grant deadline will be coming up in January. So, so I went through and looked at what some of the hot topics were. And now Breezy and Jericho, our brilliant poets, need to look at the episode and see whether or not the things that I thought were hot, and also like what I can talk about. You know, what do I know? I feel like I'm a Dickinson scholar of domesticity. I know a lot about Dickinson plumbing. It's just like, so I don't feel like this expansive. And so I just want to make sure that I'm not caught unaware and like can't answer their questions. So I have to do a lot of research. So today is their deadline to come back at what they get excited about in terms of episode 2. And then I have a mad week of reading, so that, because the recording session, which is 3 hours, is a mosh pit. And the brilliance of Lisa Rodman and Matt Martin, although I think it's more Lisa, of the editing. So what you hear if you listen to the 35 minutes of episode 1, our pilot episode, is culled down from 3 hours. And I hope that answers the question you were asking, Martha. And who, I can't remember who. Oh, wait, is there a new question? Talk about how you approached the exhibits that involve visual art. Oh, okay. You know, that's a really interesting thing, because I did a lot of visual work, installations. In fact, there was an installation and a servants walking tour of Amherst back in, what year was that? 97, maybe 96 or 97. And so there were the visual art. First, I started making visual art about this story because I thought it was about absence and loss, that we weren't going to be able to find this story. And then, so that was very evocative, and that just kind of kept me engaged. And then suddenly it was like, I needed to know the story. Wait a minute, is this like completely lost? And so then I would start moving the research along. And so the visual art and the writing, creative writing, poems, I was still writing poems then, would kind of had a sort of a push-pull, so that, you know, there would be a moment where I would just get stuck in the research and needed new avenues. So then I'd kind of go back to silk screening. You know, I was silk screening ironing boards and all these sort of, you know, putting Dickinson's language and Maid's language and my language and images and stuff onto ironing boards and tables and tablecloths and whatever, curtains and then suddenly I would just pivot in another direction and find an avenue. And then at some point it had worked its magic, and there were enough resources. I had resources in Ireland, I had resources in Massachusetts. So finally it worked its magic. And then I really started writing a book, or actually there's 5 versions of Made as Muse, but anyway. So that's how that worked. Let's see how we're doing. Okay.
Are there more questions? Or, I don't know, you've covered a lot of material. I was especially interested in the way you said Emily picked up on her servant's use of language.
Mhm. I think so. I think it was like a re-stimulus for that early love of, right, Shakespeare and Burns. And the reason I say that is that I spent a lot of time, I mean, I think it's County Cullen, when he was trying, as a poet, was trying to reactivate dialect of his youth. He actually ended up reading Irish writing as a way to activate his ear for writing poetry and bringing African-American vernacular English, or sometimes we call it, say, Black English, but linguists, at least when I was writing Made His Muse, that was the term linguists were using, was using it to activate. So I thought about, all of that kind of being very, for someone who I think of as an auditory, I think of as someone being an auditory sponge. I think of Dickinson that way, that could have used all of that speech that's sort of coming into her kitchen to activate some of those early, right, some of that early love of, for some of those classic writers that were so influential.
And so your sense is that Dickinson was really an auditory poet, which is to say that her poems were supposed to be read aloud, not just on a page.
I think every poet is auditory. I mean, because you're hearing the words in your head. Am I the only one? I just think that's where you live, is in the world of sound. Even if you're quietly writing in your room, right? The words are popping around in your head. I think all poets are that way. And I think she was, okay. So talk a bit about my enthusiasm and responsibility to new readers of Dickinson. Okay, so this was, I want to say that when I finished reading Made His Muse, I actually tried talking, I hired someone, young person I knew who was a history high school teacher, to help me think about how I would adapt Made His Muse for like K-12 or high school students. I thought I was right for it and couldn't figure out how to do it. And all the people I knew who were teachers, they're too busy to talk about stuff like this. Or if you're lucky to get them in July, great. But, you're dead the rest of the year because, right? I mean, a teacher's work is never done. And so I couldn't quite figure out how to do it. And now podcast, The Apple Show, has become that. And I am really excited about the fact that, and I hope I'm not repeating myself, one of the teachers of these, Lisa's tween and teen boys, when Lisa explained to one of the I did say this, that the teacher said, I can't wait to get this into my curriculum. How soon can I have this podcast? So that she could use it in I think a history, social studies, middle school or high school curriculum. So I feel really excited about the inclusivity of telling a story of people who sort of are under the radar, less valued in a story, right? I mean, because servants are less valued, and yet they're there all the time. So they see everything and they know everything. So not just servants, but obviously through this Mass Humanities grant, we get to have a very wide lens to get to some stories of queer youth in the 19th century. Abenaki, Nonotuck, Norwatic nations. I mean, there's just like, that's what I'm hoping to do, to embrace all those young people coming up and make it not, I mean, in the specifics is the universal. So I feel like even telling a really Amherst-centric or Western Mass-centric story, if we do it right, will communicate. So for instance, I recorded when we were in our mosh pit doing episode 1, I started to tell the Angeline Palmer story because it's so inspiring and so heartbreaking, because Angeline is saved from being trafficked to Georgia. But what about all the millions who weren't? And so it's a wonderful story, and yet it's also incredibly heartbreaking. And so Lisa was so excited hearing me tell the story in the mosh pit that we ended up recording it as a separate track, and actually also used, I hope this is an answer to your question, Jane, also did a little health education, because Jericho had asked the question, gee, in episode 1, Emily Dickinson's mother seems nonplussed by the fact that Emily and George kiss, or something like that, or George tries to kiss her. And so he was like really curious about that, saying, gee, maybe I'm from the South, but I thought that was really advanced and for that time. And as I heard Deidre Lynch, who is a professor of literature at Harvard, say this week about the Dickinson series, she says, you realize how the 19th century is so modern and so ahead of its time, which I thought was like a really interesting statement. She's a professor of literature and fandom studies. Who knew? So, so in answer to, to follow up that question, we're using the George Gould question of Jericho to me as, again, another bonus content to do a little bit of health education, actually, about options for girls who find themselves having consequences of sex at a young age with a boy. And so we sort of used it as a little health education tool. So I guess what I'm saying is the idea is to really try to meet young people where they are, because the show really skews to young people. It's wonderfully outrageous. And it sounds like season 3 ended very strongly, but I haven't seen it yet. And so we'll be using it to try to meet teens where they are. And at the same time, it becomes a way to talk about history, which meets young people where they are. I mean, they're on TikTok. So how do we grab their attention for something that's so meaty and so much about now? And that's what's exciting about the series, is it's very, I mean, this week, Elena Smith, the creator of the series, and the showrunner, said, Emily Dickinson is a superhero. So I'll leave you with that.
Are there other questions? Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about the podcast or about Dickinson studies?
Oh, what I like to say about Dickinson studies. Emily Dickinson's having her moment too. I mean, Martha Ackman's here, who wrote a fabulous book about Dickinson that came out at the beginning of the pandemic, These Fevered Days. That's fabulous. So it just feels like there's a lot of exciting things going on, and courtesy of a research assistant, I'm going to start thinking about all of that again. We are, as I showed you, there was a campaign page. So anybody who wants to contribute to helping make the podcast, you're more than welcome. And Dickinson's amazing. Maybe she is a superhero.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, it takes me. I'm sorry, I'm from another age. I think the 12th century. I'm just wondering if you would again say what you said at the beginning about what this series is called and how we find it.
Thank you. Okay. So the Dickinson show is just called Dickinson. It's on Apple TV, which is quite reasonable. I think it's $5 a month, although you could binge it for a week for free, which is how I did it originally. Or if you have an Apple product, you get it. So the Dickinson series out of Apple is just called Dickinson. And our podcast is called The Slave Is Gone, which comes from a Dickinson Civil War era poem, the last line of The lamp burns sure within. Oh, well, Jericho read it at the beginning of that 1 minute. And yeah, so
I'll find it.
yeah. And if you go, if you go to our campaign site, you can link to to the Apple show, to our stuff, to our website. So we have all those links there. Renata said, I love your title, Rogue Scholar. Yeah, that was actually something that Mass Humanities actually didn't like us putting that in. So we actually had to edit that out because it made it sound less serious, I think, or so like I was going rogue, but it does feel, I don't know. I love the title too, which was another brilliant move by Lisa, who's full of brilliant ideas. So, yeah.
So what is a rogue scholar?
Well, I think it's a play on road, a road scholar. So I think it's a play on that. And then we're not, so anyway, it's just a sort of a play on that, and to keep the whole thing playful, I think. And Renata just asked the question, what do you think of Maggie M in the show? I think in the Dickinson show, for those of you who have seen it or haven't and will, there's a Maggie character that comes in at the beginning of episode 2. And she's a composite, I think. She's a composite that brings a lot of emotional truth, I think, to the show. Much better done by Amy Belding Brown. That is that's such a dishy read, Emily's House. So I definitely recommend it. I'm totally fun. And I didn't know I was going to like it. She was nervous. But I heard about the novel from the intrepid horticulturalist, Dickinson horticulturalist, Marta McDowell said, do you know about this? Because I think they had appeared at something together. And that's a dishy, fun read. And even when she veers away from historical truth, she gets in an emotional truth that I think is so well done. And I think the same thing with the Dickinson series on Apple is deeply researched. I mean, Elena Smith, who created the series, and she started creating it in 2015. So little did I know that she was reading my book back then, reading Maid is Muse then, but she's totally read everything. And the series is deeply researched. So even when so one of the things, I had a conversation with Martha Ackman last week, because in episode 2, there's this whole thing about Edward Dickinson trying to get Emily to toe the line. And he said, well, I wrote this essay about the position of women. And so then the conversation was, I don't remember him writing something. I think maybe they're getting him confused with Frederick Douglass or something, right? Except that it's the opposite, right? About curbing women's power or public in the public sphere. And Martha's going, well, I think there were some anonymous, and maybe Polly, you can verify, also so I have you in the room and can ask you. And I think there's some other people good that there were some anonymous things that he wrote about the position of women. So, but it comes across in episode 2 of the Dickinson series. It comes across as, you know, sort of something he'd signed and delivered, and this was the position. And I'm thinking, or another example of something where maybe gets at an emotional truth. This is, of course, what I have to grapple with between now and next Friday when we record. But the girls cross-dress and go to hear a Hitchcock lecture at Amherst College, and having just so much fun, the idea of sort of empowering, feeling more powerful in male attire. And then they go in, and then the other students figure out that they're cross-dressing. So then there's this big uproar. And then I'm thinking, wait a minute, Emily Norcross Dickinson was sitting in on classes at Yale University when she was at Miss Herrick's school in New Haven. And I'm thinking, is this, you know, what are they getting at? So that's one of the things I have to sort of grapple with between now and, like, because if Jericho and Breezy bring up those kinds of questions, I have to be able to respond. And so the question is, was it getting at an emotional truth? What is the show doing when it veers away and goes into that kind of terrain where you're not sure what is historic, you know, how does that get adjudicated? Emotional truth versus historical truth, a really interesting question. And Amy Belding Brown handled it, I thought, excellently in the novel. And I think that the Apple people do too. And so I find myself sort of kind of almost like holding up the glass and thinking about each episode really, really deeply. What are they doing here? What are they getting at that is an important thing then and for young people now? Or for our moment, not just young people, but for our moment. Anyway, it's a very rich, it's a really rich series. And there's a lot to chew on. Yeah, a lot to chew on and laugh at. And sometimes get outraged about. So it's everything. It's life.
Are there other questions? I don't see anything new in the chat other than Renata saying, yay.
Oh.
But if no one has anything else, we got started late, but we ran. I think you had a chance to say what you wanted to say. Renata saying that yay was for your book, influencing the show's writer.
Oh.
Thanks, Aife.
Yeah.
Your enthusiasm is infectious. Well, that's certainly true. So thank you all for coming. We thank Aife Murray for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm so honored by all who's here. It's really thrilling. It's really thrilling.
Well, thank you.